If a player cleans his ball during play of a hole, except on the putting green, he shall incur a penalty of 1 stroke. That's the rule, Jerry.
But it's just a friendly game. Why do you always have to be such a stickler?
Because that's the way I was raised.
Welcome to Spirit of the Game, brought to you by the Colorado Golf Association. Here are your hosts, Ed Mate and Lewis Harry.
All right, welcome back. It's time for another edition of Spirit of the Game. This is Ed Mate, and I can't tell you how excited. I always say that. I'm excited. I'm always excited. I'm easily excited, but particularly today because we have on not only one of my greatest people in golf, but I love history. And unlike my guest, I'm really just, I love it, but I don't pursue it. So Rand Jerris, welcome.
Ed, thank you. You are too kind. And it's my pleasure to be with you.
Well, for those listening who don't know Rand Jerris, shame on you, but please tell our listeners, about yourself. I know it's a long answer, but it's worth hearing.
Sure.
How you got involved in golf, and let's start at the beginning.
Start at the beginning, how I got involved in golf. I found my father's golf clubs in the basement of our home in New Jersey. I was 12 years old, and a summer day, I can't tell you what month, but was poking around in the basement and found his golf clubs and thought, well, these look interesting. I, as a kid, played miniature golf a lot of times and had some sense of what golf was about, but didn't really understand the game. He was a big guy. He was like 6'4.5". And I was a 12-year-old at the time. So of course, the only club that really worked in my hands and felt right was a putter. And I found myself out on the front lawn of the house, teeing up a putter and trying to take full swings with a putter. I think I succeeded the first day in bouncing a few golf balls off the side of the neighbor's house. My dad came home from work, saw me on the front lawn, and kind of jumped out and said, "Like, well, what are you doing?" And said, "Okay, if you're serious about this, let's go to a driving range." And we spent probably 2 months, couple nights a week going to a driving range so I could figure out how golf clubs worked and knew a little bit more about the golf swing before he took me out on the golf course for the first time. And I fell in love, like immediately, instantly. With the game, with the landscape in which the game was played, with spending time with my dad. There were special things about that summer, I think, that translated into a career in the game that was unexpected and unanticipated. So I played golf through high school, played competitively on my high school team. Wasn't the top player on the team by any means, but could get my way around. Earned my varsity letter 3 years. Went off to college and was pursuing an interest in museums and art history. And that's how I found my way into the career side of golf. I ended up the summer after my freshman year in college working as an intern at the United States Golf Association Museum. In Liberty Corner, New Jersey. It was 25 minutes from my parents' house. I loved the game. I was interested in museums, and it was this really interesting way to bring together these two interests. Had a wonderful summer, an extraordinary summer. My job that summer was to create the first ever computerized catalog of the USGA Museum's collection. The museum had started in 1936 in New York City. It was the oldest sports museum in the world. They moved to New Jersey in 1972, and they hadn't fully unpacked from 1972 when I started in 1988. So wow. Then they went through a renovation of the museum in 86, 87. So my job was literally to open up boxes that no one had looked in for years, pull artifacts out, and try to catalog them, create the first ever computer catalog. And so I was like hands-on history, physically touching the putter that Bob Jones used to win the Grand Slam, the golf club that Alan Shepard used on the moon, Babe Zaharias's pitching wedge from the 1954 Women's Open when she came back from cancer to win by a record number of strokes, like one of the most inspirational stories in not just golf history, but sports history or human history. It's like amazing objects and stories. And boy, was I hooked. Just absolutely fell in love with the history of the game. Loved the job so much that I spent 10 summers through undergraduate and graduate school back at the USGA Museum, spent summers, spring break, winter break. I couldn't get enough of the museum. Honestly, as strange as this will sound, never, even at that point, wasn't thinking that I'd spend my life there. I wanted to be a college or university professor. Art history and archaeology was my field. But when I finished up my PhD, there were no teaching jobs in my area. The USGA offered me a job. The World Golf Hall of Fame, at that point in St. Augustine, Florida, offered me a job. And I thought I'll do it for a year or two while I wait for a teaching job to open up. And that became 20 more years working in golf. So in total, 32 and a half years that I spent of my life working with the USGA, all of that with the USGA Museum. Of course, with time, I took on additional responsibilities for the association. At one point, oversaw about a third of the employees, so about 110 people within the organization. The USGA conducts championships, writes rules, and then does a lot of good for the game. And that good for the game piece is really what I oversaw. So the museum, the green section, the regional affairs function, player development programs, any way in which the organization was giving back to the community, that sort of fell in my area. And that was the last 10 years of my career with the USGA.
You were good at spending the money.
I was very good at spending the money. I was a big drain. It's a wonderful thing about the organization, right? And I think most people don't understand and appreciate. They have one program that makes money. It's called the US Open. I mean, fortunately, it makes a lot of money. Television broadcast rights, merchandise, ticket sales, corporate hospitality. All of that revenue is really important because they take it all and they invest it back into the game, into the community. And as a nonprofit organization, it's their responsibility, it's their obligation to do so. And fortunately, the U.S. Open is such an international powerhouse economically that it fuels a tremendous amount of really positive things that the USGA is able to do for golf.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing. You teed off, so to speak, in the basement as a 12-year-old, and you hit that first putter across the street, and you just started chasing that ball. And look where it took you. It's an amazing story. I had a similar one, but for another time. I had a very similar sort of love at first flight experience as well. So now let's segue into what you're doing now, which I think is really exciting, because I'm sure after so much time with the USGA and working sort of with the guardrails and the institutional, restrictions, now you can kind of go you're carving your own path now. I could come up with another golf analogy. You've kind of picked a new route. So tell us what you've been doing and your new consulting business and some of the creative projects you're working on.
So I left the USGA at the end of 2021. The last 10 years were dynamic, intense, exhausting. There were things I just loved about the organization, the good that we were doing for the game. But I realized that it was taking me away from where my real passions sat. Like if I could choose how I wanted to spend my time, what I cared most about was the history of the game, and giving back to the community. And in a lot of ways, I felt like I had, as a senior executive in the organization, I spent most of my time in meetings, board meetings, personnel issues, PR and reputational issues. Like it was taking me away from golf. There were times when I felt like I could have been in just about, any sport, because you become in a way disconnected from the community. And I wanted to get back closer to golf courses, to golf clubs, to the people who played the game. And for me, that strongest connection comes through history. So I stepped away from the USGA. I looked for other full-time opportunities for a little bit of time, but while I was doing that, I kept getting phone calls. I had so many friends, so many relationships throughout the industry. People called and said, "Hey, I know you left the USGA. I heard you left the USGA. There's a project I'd love if you could work on for us." And so clubs were reaching out to me, state associations were reaching out to me. The community was reaching out and saying, we have this project in and around the history space. Can you help us out? And about 6 months into that journey of just sort of randomly getting phone calls, one day my wife came down into the basement where I often work, and I was down there in shorts and a t-shirt, feet up on the recliner, happily working on golf history. And she looked at me, she said, aren't you happy? Like, why are you chasing another full-time job? Don't you love what you're doing? And I had to stop and I thought, wow, like there's a lot less stress in my life. And I love the work that I'm doing, and I love the people I'm working with. And at that point, now close to 3 years ago, I realized, you know what? I can have a second career helping preserve and celebrate and honor and respect the history of the game. And isn't that sort of hugely meaningful? So I work with clubs around the country. As far west as Chicago, down south to Atlanta, up north into Massachusetts. And I'm working with a couple of state associations, and I'm helping them organize their historical collections, understand and appreciate the treasures that they have and the stories that they can tell, and then finding ways to bring those stories forward. In some instances, that may mean writing a book. In some instances, it's content for websites. A lot of times it's getting close to what I did a lot at the USGA Museum, which is putting history on display. So curating artifacts, images, stories, and finding interesting ways to present them. So we're putting historical displays up in clubhouses. We did a really interesting, I worked with the good folks at the Chicago District Golf Association, and we did a whole exhibit on innovation in golf manufacturing in and around Chicago. They were fortunate to receive a wonderful donation from the Hansberger family, who have been in golf club manufacturing and design for 80 years. And there's this incredible story of innovation in technology and innovation in manufacturing in and around Chicago. That was a wonderful story to tell. And I'm finding and I'm learning that there's so much history at the local level, at the club level, that's just incredibly engaging and rich and rewarding. And that's exciting for me. I thought, after 32 years as a USGA's historian, or 32 years working with the USGA Museum, what else is there to learn? But boy, was I wrong. There's so many rich and interesting stories, and the clubs have such a genuine excitement about learning more about their histories and being able to better tell their stories that it's led to a wonderful series of partnerships for me.
That's fantastic. Well, this podcast and is our sort of brand is the rules of golf. The name Spirit of the Game is, I've always said, I'm a spirit of the gamer, not a letter of the lawer. And that's really because I'm not smart enough to be a letter of the law. And I can pontificate about what I think the rules were meant to be. And I say that I wear that badge with pride, but I'm not necessarily, I'm very humble about it. I don't, one of my favorite quotes about the rules of golf, Richard Francis, who I'm sure you could tell me more about, said, paraphrasing, those who criticize the rules are challenging the sane and sensible judgment of generations of golfers. And that is true. And that I keep that in mind, because when I went to my first rules seminar in 1988, as a recent hire from the CGA, I thought I knew the rules and I was smarter than everybody in the room. And I rewrote the rules, kind of 10 simple rules. So this is the area that I really like to dig in on. Before we go there, I do just want to do a shout out for your recent recognition with the Herbert Warren Wynn Award for your book, The Prairie Rainer. Could you just mention that, if you would, please? I think I don't want to miss that in the conversation.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, that was a pretty exciting moment for me to be recognized by the USGA for the work that we did, that I did with John Moran. So one of the first calls I got after I set off on my own was from John Moran, who's a longtime historian at Chicago Golf Club. Last year was the 100th anniversary of the opening of Seth Rayner's magical and wonderful design for Chicago Golf Club. Chicago Golf had been in Wheaton since 1895. Charles Mayer McDonald had done the original golf course. And right as they were approaching World War I, they realized that after 20 years of evolution of the game and evolution of technology, they needed to replace the golf course. McDonald wrote a letter to the board and said, you have to scrap your golf course. And it set off on this journey of designing a new golf course, this amazing property on the American prairie outside Chicago. And the Prairie Rainer, it's the first time Seth Rainer, who had grown up and spent his whole life on the East Coast, the first time he ever went west, takes the train out to Chicago, is completely blown away by the prairie, the American prairie, which he hadn't experienced before, goes up in the iconic clock tower at Chicago Golf for 2 days, sits staring out one window at a landscape and says, how do I create a golf course that fits and respects and celebrates the majesty of this landscape? And he comes down out of that clock tower 2 days later, and he starts to build Chicago Golf Club. So it's the story of the book tells the entire story from like the concept to the stewardship, like right up to the present, of how this amazing and remarkable golf course was built, how it is unique, and how it changed the trajectory of American golf course architecture, and how the club has done an amazing job stewarding what's really a national treasure. It's a masterpiece, and they've done an amazing job properly stewarding and respecting and caring for Seth Rainer's golf course. Many clubs have written club histories. There's 10,000 of those books in the USGA library, and I probably had my hands on most of them at some point over 32 years. And there's these sort of very formulaic type presentations. We wanted to do something fundamentally different, and I think we've created a new genre. It's not a club history, it's a golf course history. And it really looks not at the social institution and all the club activities that are often celebrated in a club history. It goes really, really deep in helping people understand and experience Chicago Golf Club, the golf course. Whether they've ever played on it before or whether they'll never have the opportunity to see it, we wanted them to be able to share richly in the artistic and creative beauty of what that golf course represents.
Yeah, I did get to play it once. Unfortunately, I guess, not that that's ever a bad thing, but it was after a pretty torrential rain, so I didn't get to experience the firm and fast. I got to experience a water-soaked Chicago Golf Club, and nevertheless, some experience I'll never forget. Okay, so very important that we establish the context of you and your, needless to say, your credibility in the history of in the category of golf history. So let's go back to the very beginning, at least the documented beginning. What can we learn from the original 13 rules that apply today? And I know that, well, I'll let you answer, but I know that, well, I'll just let you answer. I was going to make the comment that I don't know if you consider yourself a rules expert. I do consider yourself a rules expert, because if you're an expert in the history of golf, you can't help but come across, working for the USGA in 30 years, a lot of references to the rules. So let's just go back to the original 13 and what still applies today from that original code.
Yeah. It's a wonderful document. And I think it's helpful as a historian. It's helpful to sort of put it in context. Why was this document, the article and laws of playing at golf, why was that written and codified for the first time in 1744? I don't like the word original. It is likely, let's clarify this. It's the oldest surviving document with a written set of rules. We know the game had been around for 3 centuries before this document was drafted. And it's quite likely that over that period of time, there was a common or shared understanding of the rules. I suspect there were rules that were written down for other moments or for other reasons. It's simply one of the sort of curious facts of history that this is the oldest document that we found. It survives. In that year, the golfers from Leith, the little village outside of Edinburgh, approached the town council and asked the town to donate a trophy, a silver club, to be played for as a competition. This wasn't an unprecedented moment. There was a group called the Royal Society of Archers that had petitioned the town in 1710, so 30 years earlier, to donate a silver arrow. And that arrow was the basis of a club competition. They had archery competitions every year in Leith. And so there was precedent, like there was cause for the golfers as they started to get organized, maybe as the game started to grow in popularity in Leith, that they wanted a competition of their own. And so the town council agreed. They donated a club, and these first articles actually were appended to the town minutes. They're not recorded in the club's archives. They later would be sort of transferred, but they're actually in the minutes of the town council meeting, which is a really interesting source. So they had to, at that moment, there's going to be a competition for a valuable prize. They had to codify what they collectively knew and understood to be true about the game and how it should be played. So we put it in context. This is about a competition. It gives us really interesting insight into not just how the game was played from a structural perspective, but what the experience was like. And as a historian, and sometimes I'll describe myself as a social historian of golf. I'm really intrigued by equally what they say about the play of the game as what they say about the experience of the game. So 2 paths to explore there. What they say about the play of the game. When we talk about rules, like there's these high level governing principles that a lot of us can recite, right? Play the ball as it lies, play the course as you find it. If you can't do both, play fair, right? Those are the basic principles. If you could take a 400-page rule book, you could reduce it to 3 lines. It would be those 3 lines. The spirit of those 3 lines is embedded in the 1744 rules. And I think that's what's amazing. Like there's this constancy. So play the ball as it lies. I mean, like that language is actually there in what's the no, I gotta like look it over my shoulder here because I'm looking at these. It talks about, I'd say, outside agencies. If the ball stopped by a horse, right? You play the ball as it lies. You play the ball as you've found it. Playing the courses you find it. It talks about loose impediments on the golf course, and your ability or the restriction against moving those, right? So those fundamental foundational principles are there. And the rules, when you look at them, when you look at the 13 articles, they really do speak, I think, foundationally and fundamentally to the notion of fairness. They reflect and understand and admit that golf is played in a natural environment where there's going to be unusual circumstances. I love the phrase "watery filth" that appears in the original 13 articles. I understand that there's going to be unusual conditions that you're going to have to deal with. When you come up against those, you're going to do what's the fair and the right thing to do, and you're going to continue on your way. I do think it's interesting that 13 articles now, and this is one of the sort of notions that I think I'm always curious about that I think aren't answered. The 13 articles, because this is for a competition, because this is the competition for the Silver Club, you are playing against an adversary. So it is a match play affair, not a stroke play affair. That define the competition. Does it mean they didn't play stroke play? We have no idea. The potential exists that match play and stroke play both existed in the 1700s. But this is for a match play event. And so we really get the sort of notion that you are playing against someone, playing on a natural landscape, and you're going to encounter unusual and challenging circumstances, and you're going to do the right thing. And that's something we all are exposed to when we're exposed to the game for the first time. What is the spirit of the game? Spirit of the game is about treating the person you play against with respect. It's about treating the golf course that you play on with respect. And it's about being authentic and true to the sport. And it is amazing. Again, it's amazing to me that in 13 sentences, they can actually capture those sentiments, like the core and foundational principles are embedded in the very first known rules of the game, in the same way that they inform and shape and define the experience on the golf course today.
Yeah. So when you asked, one of the questions that you already answered there is, what does the spirit of the game mean to you? And the really another favorite quote of mine, I think, is also Richard Francis, who said, there'll always be those eager to profit by the letter of the law to the detriment of the spirit. Mm-hmm. And that's what frustrates me, is when people see the rules as a 15th club, as a thing to gain an advantage over your adversary because you know them better. And that always frustrates me. So when I hear spirit of the game, that's what I think of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, can I diverge on my second path for a moment?
Oh yeah, please.
The other thing that I love about, and it's article number 1, and a lot of people focus on article 1 for a slightly different reason. So article 1, you must tee your ball within a club length of the hole. Such a radically different experience from what we have today, where greens and tees are discrete and separate architectural features. They're maintained at sort of different standards. They are physically separated from one another. And a lot of people talk about, when they look at that rule, they imagine what it says about course conditions. So if you imagine, these perfectly manicured putting surfaces today that, within a club length of that hole in the ground, someone's taking a huge divot out of the turf, right? Because they're teeing off on the next hole. It tells you something. Oh, and they're teeing up on little piles of sand, right? So you finish the hole, you reach in the hole, pull out a little pinch of sand, make a platform, set your ball on it, and you tee off. So there's these little piles of sand all around. The hole's getting bigger as the day goes along because everybody's reaching in and pulling sand out of the hole, right? You just know that there's something really different agronomically. A lot of people have talked about that. What I find it really interesting about that is it actually describes golf as a journey, as a singular journey. Like in the way we experience the game today, there's these big pauses as we walk a distance to the next tee. There was a time on the old course at St. Andrews where you never went backwards. You started you started on the first tee and you played out all the way around the loop, and you circled back and you sort of came back home, but you never walked backwards on that journey. It was always moving forward. It was always right. And along the way, you sort of paused to strike a ball, but you imagine sort of two people having a really incredible social experience where they're sort of always connected. They're always walking the same path together. It's a much, I just view it as this sort of more relaxing, more social, more engaging experience. So you sort of talk about what's the spirit of the game? Well, there's the spirit of play, but then there's the spirit of the experience. And the spirit of the experience was that of a journey. A stroll, and again, I think a very social experience where you're just together, constantly moving forward, never looking backwards. And I think about the types of relationships that we come to develop, the friendships that we have on golf courses, that we develop on golf courses that become part of our journeys through life. And I see the round of golf as this sort of interesting analogy to sort of the journey of friendship or the journey of social experiences, the journey of community, sort of always moving forward.
Well, I love that. And so based on that description of the spirit of the game, does modern golf still adhere to that spirit?
Depends what you mean by golf.
Okay.
Well, no, in this particular sense, I think there is there's a sort of fan experience of the professional game. We've taken golf and we've put it in an arena, which generates a tremendous amount of money. and ratchets up the intensity of some of this. You talked earlier about, whether you're a lawyer with a 400-page rule book or leveraging it to your advantage, when you surrounded the sport with so much financial opportunity, high financial stakes for people, it necessarily changes something sadly about the spirit and sport of the game. What's fundamentally happening between the player and the ball, between the player and the golf course, between the player and the adversary, probably hasn't changed much. When we go out and play on a beautiful Friday afternoon in the fall with a friend, that sport, that activity hasn't, I don't think, changed dramatically. But the commercial side of the sport has created what I think is a fundamentally different experience. So when I say it depends on how you define golf, maybe I separate a little bit and differentiate a little bit between what necessarily happens at the professional level when you surround the sport with hundreds of thousands of fans and millions of dollars, and the stakes are enormous. Things change. But if you strip away all of that industry and commercial activity from the sport and look purely at what's going on, play the ball as it lies, respect the golf course, play the course as you find it, and when you can't, play fair. Boy, I think that's still fundamentally there, right? And why I believe in that, because I think everybody, when they come into the sport today, my experience as a kid, when I brought my children, exposed them to the sport for the first time, colleagues at the USGA, everybody talked about it, when they brought people into the game, we still teach those three principles. We still hold those. They're sacred. They're untouchable. And as long as the community continues to onboard people with those same three notions, I think it says something really strong about the core of the game and the spirit of the game. It's still very much alive and still very strong.
Funny, when I ask that question, the first image that comes to mind when I say, is it still golf, is four golfers in golf carts with a 6-pack of beer, with music blaring, winding on the cart paths, with big old jumbo-sized heads, whacking the ball. Yes, playing the balls that lies in the course as they find it. We'll give them that. And I just think about the journey, and obviously I'm romanticizing in the walk and the communal nature. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here as somebody who appreciates art and nature and Seth Rayner and the wonderful art. It just feels to me, have we lost our way? And fundamentally, is this still golf? Because to me, golf is a walking game. And if you're not walking, and I am on a high horse here, I realize, but that's just, for me, that's golf. And I love what you said about you don't go backward. You just keep on the journey. The walk continues, and it's a walk. Mm-hmm. And so when I say, have we lost our way? Is it still the spirit of the game? I would posit, no, it's not anymore. It's accepted for those who really walk. And so I don't know. I might be.
So let's go back to my sort of statement or hypothesis that what we see in the 13 rules, there's two ways to look at it. So one is the activity and the other is the experience.
Right.
And I think what you're saying in a lot of ways is the experience has changed radically. And I think that's true. Look, society has changed radically in 300 years. And when you look at the trajectory of the game or the history of the game, what you find is, and this applies to the rules, periods of extreme growth, surges in popularity in the game have been the moments that have put the most pressure on the definition of the sport and the experience of the sport. The rules changed dramatically in the 1890s, which was, so starting in 1887, there's this phenomenon that historians call the Great Golf Boom. It started in England, where there was this surge in course building And you went from having 150 golf courses to 1,000 golf courses in the United Kingdom in a 4-year period. Same thing happens in the United States. 1894, when the USGA is founded, there's about 50 golf courses in the United States. By 1900, there's 1,000.
Wow.
20,000% growth in a 5-year period. As all these new people came into the game, the commercial activity around the game ramped up, right? And so innovators, inventors, people, there was money to be made, there's profit to be gained by the next big idea. And suddenly there's all these experiments in golf equipment. The rules go from being these small codes to, the RNA issues in a decade more than 200. They have to make 200 decisions on the rules of golf, because the game is now being played in new places in different conditions and different minors. When you were just playing on Linksland in Scotland, your ball wasn't ending up in the trees. There are no trees, right? Like the landscapes were fundamentally different. As golf moved into new environments and in new landscapes, golfers encountered conditions that hadn't been seen before. And so the sport being what it is, like, we found situations popped up in the golf courses that the existing rules didn't address. And so they had to make changes. So this happens like the 1890s, huge technological innovation, huge expansion of the game into new landscapes and environments, huge numbers of new rules that are issued, because there's this tension around growth. Same thing happens in the 1950s. So golf growth kind of suppressed by the Depression, World War II, Eisenhower's popularity. Game explodes again in the 1950s. And what happens to the rule book? The rule book goes from being this, like, it expands like dramatically in the 1950s because of a huge growth in popularity. Same story could be told in the 1980s and 1990s. So you were railing against like oversized club heads, right? So metal woods come in, the death of the persimmon wood. Oversized heads start to become possibilities because of new alloys that are introduced into club design and manufacturing. There starts to be all this pressure and tension in and around the rules. We're probably feeling it again today. I mean, for my last 10 years at the USGA, we spent so much time and invested a lot of money, devoted a lot of creative talent to talking about the challenges the game was facing because the sport was in decline. We have to close a golf course every day to restore supply demand. Golfers are leaving the game. Rounds played are down. Like, there's all this pressure, tension in the industry. Whoever imagined, let's just have a global pandemic. That'll solve all the problems.
That's right.
Now the game is surging in popularity again, which is wonderful. I mean, it's absolutely wonderful news. But it's brought it's brought new people into the game, and it's accelerated some of those pressures around the experience. You talk about golf carts and blaring music, and we've tried to make the game accessible and more welcoming and more friendly. And it's having that impact, but it's putting pressures on the experience. So I would still argue that at the moment when you separate yourself from that golf cart and the six-pack and the blaring music, and it's you staring down at the golf ball and having to hit the ball where it's sitting towards the hole, you break it down to that small moment, the purity of the activity is still intact.
Yes, very, very good distinction between.
But the experience around it has changed.
Yeah, and again, that's why I've been thinking more and more as I've gotten older. What are the emotional? I think about golf courses that I really enjoy, and instead of just trying to impress people with my understanding of the history of architecture, and I listen to a lot of podcasts, I try to educate myself. The reality is, for me, like the front nine, the traditional or back nine at John F. Kennedy Golf Course is just a charming city of Denver course that is it evokes a feeling that I love, and nobody would call that out as a wonderful. It wouldn't make anybody's list, and that it's just like they say about wine: if it tastes good, then enjoy it. And it's really kind of liberating to kind of you're absolutely right. For me, I'm speaking to the experience. So I want to because again, we could talk all day, and I know you have much better things to do. And this is not on my. I didn't prepare you for this, so I don't know if how you'll react. If you had I always love Mount Rushmore questions. So if there was a Mount Rushmore in the history of the game of golf for the rules gurus, those who made the greatest contribution to the rules of golf, who would stand out in your mind?
Well, I think you have to start with Dick Tufts, Principles Behind the Rules of Golf. And written in what I was just talking about, sort of those periods of like tension and growth in and around the game. So Tufts writes early 1950s, and he reduces a very complex set of documents, by which I mean there's the rule book, there's the decisions book, and then spirited away at that point in the RNA's office building and the USGA offices in New York City are file cabinets filled with decisions like letters, correspondence that truly reflect the complexity of the sport and the complexity of rulemaking. Tufts takes all of that and distills it down to this really elegant set of principles, which rather than the letter of the law, it's the principles that he focuses in on, and he's able to see through so much cloudiness and murkiness and nitpicking to understand what's absolutely essential in the spirit of rulemaking and in the spirit of the game. It's not the most riveting read, unless you're like a rules freak. You asked earlier if I'm like a rules expert. I would say no. I've never tried to become a rules qualified official. But I care a lot about the spirit of the sport, and to pick up Tufts and in this very understated and thus some elegant prose, he reduces this really complex activity to these core principles, and I love it. He was fortunate to be partnered during his time on the rules committee and his years of service to the USGA with an incredible mind named Joe Dye. And Joe was the first executive secretary, then what we call executive director, today CEO of the USGA, for about 40 years, from when the USGA was in New York City in the 1930s up until Joe left the USGA to be the first commissioner of the PGA Tour in 1969. And Joe, while maybe less of Joe understood the lawyerly side of the rules. He could probably have recited the rule book word for word, was incredible in his deftness and his ability to apply the rules in new and challenging and difficult situations. And I love what he represented that way. But I think more than anything else, like he understood the spirit of the people who play the game. So he layered that with a deep appreciation of where golf came from in Scotland, the Scottish mindset, the Scottish mentality. And he ultimately understood that the third principle, right? So play the ball as it lies, play the course as you find it. When you can't do both, be fair. I think Joe and I fundamentally understood be fair better than anyone else in the history of rules and rulemaking. As the top man for the USGA, he was called into some really challenging, situations in the middle of the U.S. Open, in the Women's Open, where matters of significance were on the line. The rules weren't explicit as to what could or should happen. Joe understood be fair, and I think his spirit and mentality of fairness has informed rules officials, the rulemaking community, competitions for several generations since he made his contribution. So Joe Dye would be there for me. This one's going to sound a little funny to you. Maybe I would then put Bob Jones on that Mount Rushmore. And it's for the moment in the 1926 US Open, when Jones calls a penalty on himself, when in addressing the ball in deep rough behind the green, he inadvertently caused the ball to move. Nobody could have seen it. Nobody would have known about it. Jones calls out his action, the consequences, and basically accepts the penalty. Now, he could have finished tied. He ended up, I think, coming in second place by 1 stroke, right? That decisive moment affected the outcome of the competition for him. People at the time sort of asked, like, why did you do this? No one could have seen it, right? And he has this famous line about, you might as well have praised a man for not robbing a bank, right? He sort of puts it at level. Like, it was the only thing to do. When Jones was a national icon, like, he was a hero to many people. And the fact that he put the rules, the spirit, the integrity of the game first at all moments reinforced for so many people what golf is all about. We talk about this all the time, right? The wide receiver who, traps the ball, but jumps up, trying to fool everyone and make them think like he caught it, or the outfielder who dives in for the fly ball and sort of, traps it against the turf, but gets up, like the other end of the spectrum is Bob Jones. So respectful of the rules, so respectful of the spirit of the game that he's willing to call. Like, what that did for the mindset of golfers, what it did for the reputation of the game. He wasn't doing it for his own reputation. He was doing it because he loved and he cared about the sport, and he wanted his actions to always reflect what's best for the sport. Like, that's an incredible moment for the rules. It embodies so much about this notion of like spirit of fairness and respect and integrity. That's so good about the sport. So I got to put Jones up there as well.
You have one more, and I think I know who it is. I'm waiting.
Oh no, I'm missing the obvious.
Yeah.
Who's your obvious?
PJ Boatwright.
PJ, interesting.
Well, and I say that just because I worked with a generation of rules officials who really were active during PJ's time, and he was so revered.
Mm-hmm.
And MJ Mastelier, who's a former president of the CGA and was on the executive committee and chaired the Rules of Golf Committee, MJ was a mentor of mine, and he was there when PJ passed, and he kind of had to pick up the pieces.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's just my bias.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at it, that he was just an icon.
Yep. And I think, thank you. I appreciate why you said it. As a historian, like, to me, PJ is the culmination of what Tufts and Dye put in place. Like, he was in a lot of ways their disciple, their student who carried their legacy forward. So I completely understand and appreciate where you're coming from. So, like, in that transition to the current rules official generation today, he's absolutely legendary. It's interesting. I'm always biased. Like, I love the earlier history of the game.
Yeah.
And in my head, I go back to a Charles Blair McDonald. The early leadership of the USGA, after it's formed in 1894, 1895, they had a decision to make. And that was whether they were going to write a set of rules of American golf, or whether they were going to make sure that golf, as it grew into what would become the largest, right, golf community, golf population in the world, would strike out on its own path, or whether it would embrace 500 years of tradition and history that came before. And they made a fundamental and foundational decision that the game is beautiful. That the game is challenging, that the game is rich, that the game is engaging. Like, there's so much good about what had been stewarded and created in Scotland, cherished for 500 years, that they should not diverge, that they should line the trajectory of American golf up with Scottish golf history, Scottish golf tradition, Scottish golf spirit, and preserve and protect it. And it's hard to say, like, is it McDonald? He's so funny, such a weird character that he was with his colossal ego. I'm not sure Charles Blauer McDonald always put the game above himself in the way that Bob Jones did. So I'm not quite sure I could go with I want to put McDonald on that Mount Rushmore.
Yeah. I thought
But
about
there's
it
something,
too, just because his book Scotland's Gift is so rich with
yeah,
wonderful statements on the spirit of
yeah,
the game.
yeah. So there's something, there's someone in that group or some spirit in that moment of the 1890s that to me belongs. It's like the spirit of the USGA in the 1890s belongs on that Mount Rushmore, because we don't. And look, well, we all know what's going on today in the professional game with this, the bifurcation of the rules people's favorite word. I got to use it at some point this hour. Bifurcation of the professional game. With live, like this splitting and rendering, we see how damaging it is for the sport and for the community. And that the USGA chose unity and consistency and tradition at the moment of its creation is actually a really profound moment that could have dramatically changed the history of the sport. So I want to in my Rushmore. I got to think about that a little bit more because you put me on the spot.
Yeah.
I'd want to go back to that sort of moment and understand a little better who the strongest forces were in arguing for consistency and unity and harmony in protecting what's right about the sport. Because I think that would be my fourth.
Yeah, I think that really is a pretty appropriate bookend, and because again, it set, as you say, it launched the ship. So if that hadn't happened or had gone a different direction, who knows? All right. So as we approach the very sad end of our chat today, and this is confirmed, Rand, the need to do this again, and I hope we can, because I'd love to go deep on so many different subjects: the emergence of the steel shaft, the history of the golf ball from the gut, or from the rock to the wood to, we could just talk forever about all those things. And I personally, maybe nobody would listen, but I'd sure have a good time.
We'd have good conversations.
So let's just wrap with this. You teed it up perfectly. The rollback of the golf ball. You were so involved in all of this up until, it's obviously a continuing saga, but you were really, I believe, woven in, I know, to the fabric of the distance study. And so what is your take on the rollback? How do you feel about it? And what do you see in your crystal ball, which I know nobody has the answer to, but just what are your sort of, I'll give you the floor for that final answer on that. It's a big topic.
It's a big topic. It's the right thing for the sport. I know it's controversial. I understand that people have fear of what it could mean, for them individually, golfers, or for the sport. I think the most important sort of insight that happened sort of within the walls of the USGA and the conversations that I was very involved in, that Mike Davis was spearheading when he was at the USGA at that point. It really was this sort of issue of sustainability, that our golf courses, if you look over the history of the sport, you don't have to look over 600 years of history, look at 150 years of history. The size of the golf course, the footprint of the golf course has expanded so dramatically that it has become so expensive to build and maintain golf courses. And it's putting so much pressure on the sport in terms of the cost to play the game, access to the game, and in some parts of the world, survivability of the game. When we have to put so much water, fertilizer, labor, construction costs into a platform that physically has grown so large and continues to grow, you're not going to stop the progress of technology. I mean, the players, their training regimens, they're so good today. Like, let's give them huge credit. That trajectory is not going to stop. Like, it's just going to keep pushing larger and larger. And if we don't put a governor on that, the sport's simply going to become unsustainable because golf courses are unsustainable. Too expensive, too much land, too much resource. You can argue about whether, the fundamental challenge of the game has changed. I'd argue yes. That's a whole different argument. But I think for many of us who are close to it, seeing the pressures and hearing from the architects and the owners and the operators and the superintendents of how challenging it had become to keep the game affordable and accessible and alive became the tipping point, became the strongest and the most compelling reason to do something. Because we had argued, right? The community had argued for a long time about around de-skilling of the game. And de-skilling isn't just a question of like how far the golf ball goes. It's certainly a skill element. There's other equipment issues tied in and around de-skilling, oversized club heads, probably the most important. But boy, to put a governor on the future growth of the footprint of the golf course gave us some confidence that we could keep the game healthy and sustainable for a couple generations to come. I don't know I think that argument has been talked over too much. If you go back to the USGA's original announcements when we released Distance Insights report, when the first communications went out, that was front and center in the conversation, the messaging that we put forward. And I think a lot of the argument of somehow you're taking fun away, like shouted down you need to have a place to play and it needs to be affordable. And I think that's unfortunate. So I'd love to see some of those fundamental and very strong and compelling data and information around cost and accessibility of the game kind of come to the forefront. I think the rollback is going to move forward. It'll be interesting what happens with the professional tours. Although in the past, there have been moments when there's been a lot of noise that the tours have made, but when push comes to shove, they don't want to make their own rules. It's a very complicated process and fraught with all sorts of challenges for them. I suspect things will naturally fall into line, but it will have done something important for the sport, which is to put in place the notion that we're going to protect the sport against sort of gross commercial exploitation that threatens to make it inaccessible and really change the character of what's happening on the golf course.
Well, we'll leave it there for today. Rand, thank you so much for joining for this wonderful conversation. And I definitely, to the extent you'll have us, would love to do part 2 of this and dig even deeper into the rich history of the game and your immense passion for it and knowledge of it. So thank you for joining.
You're very welcome, Ed. Thanks so much for the invitation to join, and I will be very happy to join you again.